Hi, this is my new 18-inch homemade wood cutting bandsaw. It's a bandsaw that I built completely from scratch out of wood, well, with a few bits of metal here and there. It's all homemade, and I'd say it cuts pretty good, and let me show you how it runs. So let's have a look inside the bandsaw. The wheels for this bandsaw are just made out of 3/4 inch birch plywood with some flange bearings in the middle, and then a rim made out of hardwood towards the edge, and a kid's bicycle inner tube stretched over the rim. The shape of the actual edge of the rim is very important for tracking a blade. On the regular bandsaw, you have rims that are flat on the outside with a slight bump on them given to them by the tire. But because I'm only using a bicycle inner tube for a tire, the bump is actually part of the wheel. The advantage of that is a pair of bandsaw tires for this size bandsaw would cost about $60 plus shipping, and the inner tubes cost about $4 a piece, so much cheaper that way. My blade guides are made out of just wooden blocks on the side and some roller blade ball bearings to hold for the thrust on the back of the blade, both the top and the bottom. The bottom side often gets a little bit dusty. To adjust these, I need to put an Allen key in here, and these blocks have slots in them. So when I loosen the screw here, I can move this block in and out like that to get them tight against the blade. So with the table removed, it's easy to see both blade guides. And the upper blade guide can be adjusted up and down. There's a block here which locks this vertical bar in place, so if I loosen this screw, it slides up and down. So I have the camera in the other hand, so it's kind of hard to show how that works. On the back, there's just a little knob here for tightening the vertical position in place. And when I tighten it, it locks this whole bar in place, which also prevents it from getting any sort of side wiggle room. A cool feature about this bandsaw not found in commercial bandsaws is sort of a passive dust collection system. When I make a cut, the sawdust all gets thrown down here, and there's a hole in the bottom of the case so that the sawdust can fall into my sawdust drawer here. And most of the sawdust does in fact end up in that drawer. There is a slight bit of a challenge in that this wheel, when it's turning, will stir up quite a bit of wind inside the case, which tends to blow the sawdust all around. I added some baffles to the inside of the bottom cover here, these 3 blocks here, which actually kind of fit in this space here, here, and here, and that to some extent prevents the air from circulating too much in there, so that the air does in fact get ejected at the bottom. The saw is powered by this really old 1.5 horsepower motor that runs at 3,500 RPM, and it drives a belt directly to a big pulley on here. I had to add the belt cover on the back, not so much for my own safety, but because when I use a bandsaw, there's always little bits of wood that fall off the end of the table, and I didn't want to get those into the belt. So the belt cover is actually there more to protect the belt, not so much me. With its powerful motor, this saw can actually do quite a bit of resawing. So I've got a chunk of maple here that is almost 5 inches wide, about 12 centimeters wide, and I'm going to slice through the middle of it with the bandsaw here. And this is the surface of the cut that I just made. It's really quite smooth. If you look at it, it's got a very nice texture to it. Not quite finishing quality, but it wouldn't take much to get that smooth. So with this close-up, hope you get a better sense of just how smooth this cut is. So that's my thumb there, and it's a pretty smooth texture on the wood. You probably saw the bandsaw moving around a little bit when I was doing a shot of that cut. That's because I keep the bandsaw on a dolly and I was pushing on it hard enough to actually move it. The bandsaw is actually not that hard to move. It only weighs a little bit over 200 pounds, of which about 80 pounds is that really heavy old motor. Because I built the bandsaw out of wood, it's actually a lot lighter than most bandsaws of this size, so let me demonstrate what I can do with this bandsaw. Ooh, I'm so strong. I dare you to try that with a commercial bandsaw. An important aspect of any bandsaw is how long does it take to change the blade. I actually built this bandsaw because I didn't want to keep changing the blade between this one and my 14-inch bandsaw. But let me show you how I do a blade change on it so you get an idea of how long it takes. So take the cable off. It comes off pretty easily and it gives me good access to the blade guides on the bottom. And we'll take the covers off. Okay, next I have to release the blade tension. Okay, with the blade tension loosened, I can now get the blade out. And here's my 1/4-inch blade that I'm going to put in. Okay, that seems to be in there, so now I just need to tighten that up. And check the tracking. Looks good. I got to show you in more detail my cool blade tensioning mechanism. So this here mounts the wheel. This knob is for adjusting the tilt, for adjusting tracking, and that whole assembly can move up and down. And it's moved up and down by this lever, and I have these two springs here. So I get about a 4-to-1 advantage here. And these springs, 2 of them, gives me lots of tension. And then I have this ratchet wheel, which pulls on this string here to pull it up, and this lever for ratcheting it in. And it's very efficient. I've actually just tensioned the blade for the right tension for a 1/4-inch blade. The main catch with this mechanism, it's so much fun and so quick to tension the blade that it's very easy to over-tension the blade. The saw at maximum tension will put about 200 pounds of tension on the blade, which for my 1/4-inch blade is more than it should get. So my saw blade is tracking right near the front of my guide blocks, which is just perfect, so I don't need to adjust those at all. I still need to bring the 2 thrust bearings forward so that they're closer to the blade, and I use an Allen key like this to just loosen the screw in the back, and then I can bring this bearing forward. I want to bring it to about 1 millimeter from the blade so that when the blade is running normally it doesn't actually hit the bearings, but as soon as I push against it with a piece of wood, it will move back a little bit and the bearings are there to support it against the thrust. Okay, so I've got both of these set. And well, maybe I have a little bit of extra space down here, so let me move one of the guide blocks. Just loosen that. It's got a slot in it so I can move it in and out. And these are just wooden guide blocks, so they do wear out a bit, but the plus side on them is they have very little friction. And if they're too tight, they just wear themselves away. so no problem. They don't wear that fast. I've already dulled at least one blade with this without having had to replace the guide blocks, so they're doing okay. And I've got some lignum vitae that I might use to make better guide blocks out of, but so far these oil-soaked maple ones have lasted surprisingly long. So let's just make sure this runs nicely by just turning it on and washing it. Working good? So now let's put the dust covers back on, or guards as you might want to call them. Back on. Ta-da! So now that I've got the 1/4-inch blade in here, which is for cutting tighter corners, let's cut some tight corners in a fairly thick piece of wood. So this is about as tight as I can cut with this blade. You can see it's a pretty smooth cut. It's actually even a bit shiny, because as I was going around the corner, the blade was rubbing against the inside of the cut, which actually polished it a bit, and the cut was actually pretty smooth to begin with, so it really is shiny. You may be wondering about the whining noise that you heard while I was making that cut. It's these little thrust bearings here that I'm using. They're actually just from a pair of roller blades. The reason they make so much noise is they have to run about 10,000 RPM, and they're probably not meant for this kind of load. So I'll probably just have to replace them eventually, but I have lots of those bearings, so in the meantime I'll just put up with the noise. The reason they have to run so fast is this blade here is actually moving at about 2,800 feet per minute, which for a bandsaw is relatively fast, but with the motor that I had and the pulleys, that's about the best I could do. And having the blade move that fast, I have enough power to keep it up, and it does make the bandsaw cut a lot faster, so all the better. Here's comparing my homemade bandsaw with my 14-inch bandsaw, which I've owned forever. The bandsaw, it is unfortunately a bit louder than the 14-incher, but it's also a lot bigger, and being made out of wood, I don't actually have a lot of cast iron that I can use to just give it lots of mass, so I'll give you a sound comparison of how loud these saws are. 14-incher. Homemade. Showing off my homemade bandsaw. I've got a lot of details and photographs of how I built this bandsaw. Just go to woodgears.ca/bandsaw and you can read a lot more about how I built this bandsaw and the challenges I faced in figuring out how to make the bandsaw work. Making this bandsaw has been a lot of fun and very satisfying, and I'm actually happy that I managed to get a pretty decent bandsaw out of it. So thanks for watching.